So you may know Sally already as one of the co-organisers of these Digital Humanities Hangouts, along with Daniel Alves at the Nova University in Lisbon and Patricia Murieta Flores at Lancaster University. But Sally is also the Digital Humanities Research Coordinator at the Ghent Centre for Digital Humanities and the Belgium Coordinator for DARIA. So Sally's work is a crucial area of digital humanities research, working specifically with digital tools, methods and collections, specifically in a library context. And that's key to what she's talking about today with DATA-KBR-BE, experimenting with digital humanities datasets at the Royal Library of Belgium. So I'll hand over to you.
Wow, thank you, Catherine. I'm learning stuff about myself as well. So welcome on behalf of me as well to our first Digital Humanities Hangout for 2021. And just before you joined, Catherine and I were just talking, it's more or less a year since we all went into lockdown. So it's not what we expected, but it's wonderful that we've made a little history with the Hangouts as well. So thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. So as Catherine has just said, well, it's 11 months. So I gave one of the first presentations in our first round of DHangouts that we did last year on the 17th of April, where I talked about digital cultural heritage as humanities data, and particularly focusing on library labs and cultural heritage labs. What I would like to do is in the context of that, so I've called it kind of a year in the life of a part-time PhD student during the global pandemic. I want to continue talking a bit about cultural heritage data as humanities research data. I'd like us to think about the difference and the interrelationships between collections, corpora and datasets. And I think something that I learned over the last year was that what I'm doing is practice-based part-time pragmatism. So how do I keep moving forward step by step on my PhD while I'm still working full time and we're sitting in a global pandemic? So I've sort of been thinking at a meta level about that work as well. And many of you will know the FAIR principles. You can see the image at the bottom. So that's findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And I think that one of the things I learned from the last Hangout is that I had far too many slides, and a couple of you said to me afterwards that I really need to find focus because there's so many exciting things we could be looking at. So at the moment, I think I'm focusing on the accessible of FAIR. So just to give you a quick reminder, so the working title of my PhD is From Digital Collections to Digital Scholarship, addressing the challenges of using digital cultural heritage collections in digital humanities research. So just a couple of things. Digital cultural heritage for me here is both digitized, as in things like digitized newspapers, and also born digital, such as web archives or social media archives. And the other thing I'd just like to mention is the digital here is in brackets related to humanities research, because I would be really interested in seeing how we can build in digital collections to all types of humanities research, not depending on how digitally literate anybody is. So humanities in the widest sense as well. So a couple of things that have moved on from the formal point of view. So Ghent University Faculty of Arts and Philosophy, which is where I will be doing my PhD, are exploring the possibility of awarding a new type. So you have in Belgian universities, you have all these official titles of doctorates, and they're thinking at the moment of awarding a new kind of doctorate title of the Doctor in Digital Humanities. So that would be very interesting for me, particularly because of the interdisciplinary nature of the work that I do. I've been looking at the guidelines, and I think you won't be able to read it, but down the bottom right hand of the corner, but there is the link there. I'm really thinking from the pragmatic perspective of doing an article-based doctorate. And that means, I'll just read it here, there needs to be at least 4 submitted peer-reviewed publications, and that can be articles or chapters in a book. 2 of these publications need to be published or formally accepted for publication, and at least 3 of these contributions, the doctoral student needs to be the co-author. The lead author. So that's very interesting to take in account while I'm thinking about all of these things. And if you're interested, and we'll share the slides afterwards, the work in progress research proposal is there in a Google Doc to share with everybody. So just a couple of updates first. So I would first like to celebrate failure. I think I mentioned in the presentation I gave last year about the British Library PhD placement scheme. In the 2019 one, they had some very interesting work related to practice-based research. So if in the context of a national library, such as the British Library, where you can do research within an institution and how that relates. So that was something very interesting, and it's one of the methodologies that I would like to cover within my PhD research. Secondly, this year, so I think it was around the end of last year, the British Library opened its new placement scheme. And the one that I was particularly interested in was science policy at the British Library. So this time I dared to apply, and with the support of my PhD supervisor, Professor Christopher Brugger, we submitted that at the end of last year. Yes, it didn't work, and that is okay. And I think that is what I would like to share, that is okay to try. And even though I didn't succeed in this case, I did learn some lessons that will be useful for my PhD. So the lessons I learned, I have an interest in science policy. So science policy could be termed of research policy or different types of policies related to the research that I'm doing. So I'm particularly interested in how both European and national policies can be translated into institutional strategy, policy and operationally within a national library context. So for example, out of one of the projects that we're doing at the Royal Library, we are starting to develop a data strategy at KBR, the Royal Library of Belgium, and it's interesting to see how that works in practice. So I've read a lot of policy related to digitization, for example, and it's now to see how policy can be translated into institutional practice, and I find that incredibly interesting. Also related to that, we're doing a lot of work in Flanders on open science policy, particularly related to the Flemish Open Science Cloud and the Flemish Research Data Network. So I've been doing some work around there that is all learning that can contribute to my PhD as well. So as well as celebrating failure, I decided I changed this, not celebrating success quite yet, but celebrating work in progress. Since I last presented, the Data.KBR project, which is funded by the Belgian Science Policy Office, has been accepted and launched, and that will be the main content of my presentation today. So that is definitely a work in progress success. Thinking also about policy, together with Toma Tasovac and Rejbet Tofsifra from DARIA EU. In response to, there was a public consultation related to digitization technologies and cultural heritage at the European level over the summer last year. And on behalf of DARIA, we submitted a response to that public consultation. And as a result of that, we wrote a short white paper or position paper on the role of of cultural heritage data from a humanities perspective. So that's available as open access, and you can find the link there. But that helped us think about the interrelationship between cultural heritage data and humanities research. And finally, and I think some of the authors are even in this room, we've started working on a collected book related to digital humanities for librarians, an introduction. The idea behind this book is to introduce people and professionals in the cultural heritage sector to what digital humanities is, and also to look together with the humanities research how digital has impacted on that and look towards the future. So at the end of last year, we got an international team of experts signed up to be the chapter authors, and now the draft chapters are in production. So that's all very exciting work that is happening at the moment in this area. So now moving on to the specific about this experimentation with collections as data. So the DATA-KBR project is officially titled Facilitating Data Level Access to KBR's Digitized and Born Digital Collections for Digital Humanities Research. As I just said, it's funded by the Belgian Science Policy Office, and the lead partner is the KBR, the Royal Library of Belgium, together with Ghent University and the University of Antwerp, and there is the official project website. I think last time in around June, Gustavo Candela from the University of Alicante presented at one of the DHangouts related to Jupyter notebooks and how you can access, and that is very closely related to this collections as data initiative. So collections as data was originally set up in the United States. They've had 2 phases now. So the first one came to an end probably about 18 months, 2 years ago, called Always Already Computational Collections as Data. And the idea was to encourage cultural heritage professionals to think differently about how they provide access to their data, and particularly in a way where it is ready or more ready for computational research. So there was a lot in the first phase of that project. There was a lot of work around consultation, what are the needs, things like this, a lot of workshops, and all of this was written up into a great final report, which can be found on the website. And then they had a second grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation related to the actual implementation of collections as data. At the moment, it's primarily happening in North America, both in the United States and in Canada as well, I think. But it's less European orientated. So this was one of the areas of inspiration that made us think about what would be interesting for putting in this data.kbr project proposal. And that's one of the things we would like to start thinking about. How could collections as data be implemented at the KBR, but also more widely in Belgium and hopefully more widely across Europe? So just to give a sort of a practical example, collections as data, I also term it data level access to the collections. So if you imagine you've got a collection of digitized newspapers, for example, if you go behind the scenes, and this is an example of what behind the scenes may look like, here you have the underlying files related to the digital cultural heritage resources. So for example, this is one of the KBR's newspapers. I think if I remember correctly, it's De Standaard, a Dutch language newspaper. And I don't know if you can see, you've got the XML files, which are XML Alto files, which have the details. For example, they have the digitized text that has been OCR'd as part of the digitization process. You also have the METS file, which is another XML file, which creates the structure of how the page is laid out and how the interrelationship between different parts. So this is more technical metadata. You can see a number of PDF files, so that's actually what the page looks like as you would see it in a newspaper page. And then here you've got 2 TIFF files here, and that's the sort of high resolution digitized image as well. So if you want to do some kind of data analysis by means of digital humanities tools and methods, it's often you don't need a digital library, and doing search in a digital library, you probably want access to the underlying data files, and that's what we're trying to provide, seeing how we can do that in a sustainable way, so it's not ad hoc extraction every time a researcher may want that. So at the moment we are focusing, so we have a longer term goal, hopefully over the next 5 years or so, but at the moment we're working on a 24-month feasibility study, and we're going to focus on KBR's digitized newspaper collection. So that's called Belgische Press. At the moment there's around 110 Belgian newspapers from 1840 to around 1970. And that's the ones we're going to be focusing on for the first phase of this project. So here, yes, it was the standard, and here you can see what that will probably be the PDF and what it looked like, and this is the underlying data. So that's where we want to move from. If we've got, this is the collection of all of the newspapers, and then you can go into an individual issue of that paper, and then underneath you've got the underlying data, and how might we provide that in a way that is easy to be used for digital humanities research. So one of these things is that we didn't want to do this work in a vacuum. So it's very important, and that's something that also came back in the collections as data projects, is that they need to be interdisciplinary projects, or otherwise interdomain projects. So it's important that you have cultural heritage professionals who either know about digitization or about the actual physical collections of the, in this case, newspapers. But you also need the humanities researchers that are going to actually do the research based on the collections that are used. And we also found out that we need either computer scientists or data scientists, which will help use their particular algorithms to help facilitate this process. So these are the 3 interdisciplinary research scenarios we've chosen in order to sort of put a research framework around the project. So the first one, Collective Action Belgium, that is led by our own centre, the Ghent Centre for Digital Humanities. That focuses on social history, and particularly in the interbellum and World War II period. And what we're trying to do is trace the dynamics of contention, strike, demonstration, and other forms of collective action in Belgium as it has been reported in the newspaper collections. The second one, the Feuilleton in Belgium, is led by the best acronym in the world, ACDC, the Antwerp Centre for Digital Humanities. This is a literary studies case study, and it's focusing on the period of 1830, when Belgium was officially set up as a country, until 1930, so a 100 years period. And they are looking to map the publication of literature in Belgian newspapers across the first century of the Belgian nation. So therefore, for example, in some of the early literary supplements, you would often get parts of a new novel published, or other types of literary works like poems and this sort of thing published within the newspaper in serial form. So that's something we want to do some research on together with the colleagues at the University of Antwerp. And finally, the history of Belgium journalism. So there's a new research group being set up called CAMI, who are developing an archive and research centre related to the history of media in Belgium. And this particular case study will look at tracing the history of Belgian journalism through the lens of critical discourses about journalism in Belgian newspapers. As some of you may know, there are very many pillarization, as in different kinds of, you can have different kinds of associations. So for example, you could have the Catholic Society or something, the Socialist Society, the Liberal Society, and that is also in connecting with journalism movements. So that is something they will be looking at in these 3 case studies. And as I just mentioned, the importance of data science expertise. So if we're thinking, if I take the middle case study here, the feuilleton in Belgium, if we wanted to extract just these literary supplements from the newspapers, how might we do that? So we've teamed up at Ghent University. We have ID Lab, who are the data science lab at the University of Ghent, and they've been working with us on helping finding computational ways where we can extract the knowledge from the newspapers. So Dilawar Ali and Steven Verstockt, who work at ID Lab, have been working on, for example, here, this is Le Peuple, one of the French language newspapers at the Royal Library. And I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but they've been using document layout analysis to try and extract, so you can see the different colors probably, and there are numbers on there. So they've been using various algorithms in order to say which articles, which blocks of text, which titles, which images relate to the same news article. So they've been doing some work for us. So in the next phase, hopefully they'll be able to say, can they automatically extract just the literary supplements from a particular, some particular newspaper runs within the whole digitized collection. So this is one of my favorite slides. Are we talking about collections or corpora? And that also relates to the research questions. So I'm very interested in this question. So from a librarian perspective, you're often thinking about collections, but from a research perspective, you're often thinking about which of the particular, for example, newspapers, do you want to include in your data set or corpora? And how can we balance these two? Which comes first? How can we sort of think about it? Because it's in some way, 2 ways of looking at the same thing, but from a different perspective. So that's one of the things we've been thinking about. So I think Gustavo is even in the room, but he did a great article to go together with his colleagues for the Journal of Information Science last year. About how the collections as data methodology could actually be implemented in real life scenario. So he did this here. You can see his framework of how you move from digital collection, the thing at the top, the blue bit at the top, towards a data set. And in the article, and there is the open access version as well, when we can share the slides later, you can see he suggested various ways and various steps of how to do that. So within the Data.KBR project, one of the things we've been looking at, okay, Gustavo and colleagues wrote this article, can we implement that at practice at the KBR? So just thinking about how we're going to move forward from here. So if you think we have these 3 research scenarios, the collective action, the feuilleton, the literary studies, and the history of Belgian journalism, we're working very closely together with the KBR's ICT department in order to help us with this. In the project, we agreed that we could have 3 data extractions during the project in order to lessen the burden on the ICT department. And we had a discussion, we had a brainstorming workshop with both the researchers, the IT experts, the collection specialists as to how we might do this. So we had 3 approaches. Firstly, if we've got 3 data sets and 3 collections, 3 data extracts, sorry, we could just simply, scenario 1 is we could have 1 data set per scenario. And then questions such as which one would we start with? Scenario 2, we could do it in an iterative process. So we could have a shared data set and have 3 different iterations of the shared data set. And then scenario 3, We could have the first version of a test data set and then decide later what we wanted to do with the second and third iterations. So we went with scenario 3. Let's go with a shared test data set. So just to give you a bit more idea, so Collective Action Belgium, how do you start understanding which demonstrations have appeared in the Belgian newspaper Corpus? So what the research team there thought, well, 1st of May is often thought of as you have Labour Day, there are many demonstrations. So maybe we could start with as a date-centered approach. So we could have 1st of May over a number of years period and see, looking at those particular editions of the newspapers, and perhaps that would be a good source to try and automatically extract articles relating to, for example, Labour Day demonstrations. For the feuilleton in Belgium, our colleagues in Antwerp, they wanted to have a balance between French and Dutch language newspapers, and they looked around. It is not until 1885 when there was enough Dutch language newspapers as well. So they've selected 6 newspapers that may be interesting, potentially from the year 1885. And journalism in Belgium, they've got a long list, and it's not all listed here, of both the Dutch, French, and maybe even the German language newspapers within there, within the collections. So they're interested in a very wide range. So the next step for us is to have a particular brainstorm workshop to decide how we are going to put this data set together for this first test data set, which data formats, how many years, what's the size of the data, so we can do this first extraction in the coming weeks. And just to say here, so this is where we're getting to at the moment. So you can see the research scenarios on the left. So we've got an example of a feuilleton. We've got the example of the collective action, and then we've got the more description related to the history of Belgian journalism. On the right, we've got Belgica Press as the 109 digitized Belgian newspapers. We've got an Excel sheet to try and look at what is the language, what are the year of publications, and what are the overlaps between the different case studies. And now we've got to decide which files, which data formats we're going to extract. And of course, copyright and other legal issues are very important. So that's where we are at now. We're going to have a workshop running for about 2 hours with the various people. And by the end, we want to have a detailed textual description of what this data set might look like. So just wrapping up, a couple of interesting articles and blog posts I would like to share with you all. So one thing that has happened over the last year that we've been very interested in is the Data Foundry at the National Library of Scotland. And Sarah Ames and Stuart Lewis from the National Library of Scotland have written a very interesting article, also available as open access, about how they implemented collections as data at the National Library of Scotland. And a great title, Disrupting the Library, Digital Scholarship and Big Data at the National Library of Scotland. So if you're interested in that, well worth a read. And reading that article, I found out that they have an open data publication plan at the National Library of Scotland. So that's very useful as to something that could provide us an inspiration as to how at the Royal Library we might want to have some sort of open data publication plan for the Royal Library's collections. Secondly, 2 other interesting articles. The first one, Gustavo actually pointed me to this. This is an article from the University of Utah's Marriott Library. They wrote about how they had moved from a digital library to open data sets. That's openly available as open access, so you can read that article. And I also added a link here to the Collections as Data GitHub repository, where you can see some collections as data in progress in real life. And secondly, for the JSIS, the Journal of the Association of Information Science and Technology, I got the opportunity to read this article from the NewsEye team about integrated interdisciplinary workflows for research on historical newspapers, and then looking at the perspectives of humanities scholars, computer sciences, scientists, and librarians. I think this is currently under review, and I was lucky enough to be one of the reviewers, so hopefully it will be published before the summer. But it really tried to look at the different cultures and how we, as 3 different scientific cultures, as in cultural heritage, humanities, and computer science, how we might come together and how we can build interdisciplinary workflows to facilitate our collaboration together. So I think this is really excellent work, and hopefully somebody from that team may be able to present this in one of the Hangouts in the later sessions. And finally, this came out, I think, just yesterday, and I wanted to read it before today, but I haven't. Emmanuelle Bermez, who I mentioned in the last Hangout, she just published her PhD on the collections of the French National Library. She's been doing some work around artificial intelligence and digital cultural heritage. So this blog post, yes, was published 10th of March. But one of the interesting things is, I think it talks about the data lab at the French National Library that she's been helping to set up. So I haven't read the article yet, but I think it's very interesting to keep an eye on this. And if you're interested in interdisciplinary collaboration, the NewsEye conference is happening next week with the theme Interdisciplinary Collaboration. There is the URL. And yeah, it's openly available via MS Teams, so you're welcome to join. You do need to register in advance to get that URL, but that may be an interesting conference to attend for free if you're interested. And then I can't see my watch, but I'm probably way over time. Just a couple of next steps. So as part of the book on digital humanities in librarians, I will be co-authoring an article together with Ditte Laursen from the Royal Library of Denmark in Copenhagen about these challenges related to digital cultural heritage and digital humanities. And we would like to do some real thinking about different approaches from collections, corpora, data sets, and how they can be practically implemented. We've just put in a proposal to the DH Benelux conference on this, collections as data interdisciplinary experiments with the KBR's digital historical newspapers. So we'll see if that's accepted. And that's a nice interdisciplinary article we've written together with the whole team. Some of you may know the ICDAR conference, and as part of that, there will be a specific workshop on historical document imaging and processing. It's called HIP 21. That will be happening, well, online or in Lausanne in September next year. The deadline is the 17th of May, and we may do an article related to this automatic extraction related to the research scenarios. And finally, and last but not least, I hope to be able to officially register as a part-time student for my PhD within 2021. So thanks very much. I hope that was interesting, and I'm looking forward to hear what questions, comments, feedback you may have.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was a really, it was a great introduction to what seems like a very interesting interdisciplinary project. You always seem to be working on so many fascinating things at the same time, all whilst doing a PhD as well, which is kind of fantastic. Also, I was going to say thank you for all the links throughout your presentation. They all seem very useful, so we should definitely make those available after the session, if that's all right with you.
Perfect, yes, of course.
So I think we already have a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to, can you see them now? Or
yes, I can see
okay.
them now, brilliant. So Ben, hi Ben. So question, how do you foresee collaborating with and managing these different research projects as part of your PhD? Seems like it could be quite a challenge. Yes, absolutely. It's interesting. I think that slide disappeared. I had a slide this morning so how I work, and it's probably not the right way to work, but for my proposal, I have this running Google document, and I should remember to download it every few weeks and put a copy of it somewhere else so that I have it in case Google suddenly disappears. But as part of my work, so I now have the two jobs, the one at the Royal Library and the one at Ghent. I just do my day job, and then if in the context of that I find interesting research articles, then I just put them into this Google document and keep reading it, and it's kind of like an organic process at the moment. So in terms of time, I'm a morning person, so what I've been what I'm doing at the moment is between 8 and 9 in the morning, try to really have just 1 hour to think. Because that's what I think the most difficult thing is. If you're running between Zoom meetings, I think I spend about 7 hours a day in Zoom or MS Teams, to try and just have a quiet hour to think and rearrange these things a little bit. And that's how I'm doing it, but it's very pragmatic and on the fly. Right, Patty here, question. This work with newspapers is fantastic. One of the main challenges in extracting information from this kind of source is precisely its format. Could you say a bit more about this work, how they've gone so far, if you know? Thank you for putting the "if you know." So I don't understand all the algorithms. I hopefully will learn more next week because they've got some papers there. From what I can remember, so they've been doing various different, using various different algorithms. One of the things they've been looking at is first identifying the titles, then identifying the images, and then doing the clustering. So I probably should know more about this and read it up in more detail, but they're really doing it from an image perspective and not from a textual perspective, I think. Having said that, they have been looking at the Alto files as well, so I've got a feeling they may have combined the two. So I should read up more about that, but I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. Right. Also, a second question from Patty. How different do you find the implementation of interdisciplinary work at university libraries versus national libraries? That's an incredibly interesting question, and it's something that I kind of fight with in some ways. One of the things, so at Ghent, if I use the Ghent example in particular, we have a main university library, and then we have the faculty libraries as well. So the main university library is where they have special collections. So for example, Ghent University Library was one of the first Google Books libraries to have a lot of the collections digitized by Google. Whereas in the faculty libraries, it's more practically helping the researchers and the students, and they do more work towards licensed digital resources. So I think at the national libraries, it's often their own collections, and a bit the university, the main central university library. And I can't remember, I'm very bad at this. We had a demonstration from one of the big providers about a text and data mining licensed electronic database, where you could do some text mining in there. So that's one of the differences, I think, the licensed versus non-licensed resources. And I think also it tends to be, if the data is free, then the interdisciplinary work with computer scientists and data science is easier, because otherwise it has to be developed within the framework of the licensed electronic resources. Okay, just scrolling down. Thanks very much for these questions. This is great. Ben, again, what do you think are the main ways that DH researchers, computer scientists and librarians can work more closely? This is a very interesting question, because from what we have noticed, well, what I've sort of observed, let's say so far, is that one of the things, and maybe this sounds a bit banal, But one of the things I've noticed is that people work at different speeds. And I think that can be quite frustrating. So computer scientists tend to work extremely quickly, and they want to, they want to get ahead and they want to test algorithms, whereas both the cultural heritage people and the digital humanities people seem to work at a different speed. That's why we came up with the interdisciplinary research scenarios as a way that something we could have a framework where we could have a shared goal, and it was a sort of time limited project, so we could do it in a specific, around a 3-month period, something like that. In the article by, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Sarah Obliche and her colleagues from the NewsEye team, they were talking also about having integrated infrastructure to help that collaboration as well, looking at different workflows to see what could be standardized. So yeah, in our project, a kind of research scenario where everybody's working towards the same goal, and then have infrastructure to support that. Good question from Gustavo. Thanks, Gustavo. When do you think DATA-KBR will be published? Any idea of how many data sets will be included? So, difficult question. In terms of the project, so we didn't talk about that today. There should be a platform that will be developed, and we've got to see how that platform looks like. But the first version of this platform needs to be ready by month 18 of the project, which is December this year, if I remember off the top of my head, the beta version, and then a new sort of version 1.0 in summer next year. So we've got about a year and a half from now. What we've promised is 3 data sets initially, based on 3 scenarios. So that's what we've promised initially. But this is a part of a longer term plan at the KBR that we would like to apply for more funding, for example. So other projects we've already started thinking about is that obviously the digitized newspapers is one thing. We have a big collection of digitized periodicals, and there are other collections that have been digitized as part of other research projects. I think of there's some brilliant, I think they're called photo novels. I don't know if that's a good English translation that they've been doing some work on at the KBR, where it's kind of like comics, but with photos, and they've done a big collection of that, the digitization of that. So could we think about sharing those? And also the Born Digital collections, the web archive, the social media archive, there's a lot of legal restrictions. And then there's all the metadata at the National Library as well. So the Belgian bibliography, for example, is something that they would like to publish as well. So that's why this plan that the National Library of Scotland has set up, we've got to think what might be the planning for that, what is the infrastructure, because this is really a feasibility study. There isn't enough money to build extensive infrastructure or anything. So what is the pragmatic way to set this up, and what changes may we need to propose in the internal ICT infrastructure? So for this project, we promise at least 3 data sets, and then we see after that. Peter, hi Peter, thanks for your question. Do you see if there is a chance for a European collections as data project? Oh, yes, please. The Heritage Data Reuse Charter might be a step into that. And another idea for DATA-KBR, maybe different catalogues could be low-hanging fruit. I guess there's a lot digitally available in-house. Yes, so I kind of covered the catalogues thing. Yeah, that is of interest. We promised it for the digitized newspapers in Data.KBR, but the cataloging and data sciences team or whatever within the KBR is very interested in making, for example, the Belgian bibliography available. And there is another project related to that where some preparatory work could be done. Yes, I would love there to be a collections as data project at a European level. We did submit a project proposal last year that unfortunately they didn't understand it. That's how I like to say. I didn't put that as a failure down. But yes, we would definitely like to do that. And the Heritage Data Reuse Charter, which some of you may know, I think that was initiated by Daria together with Europeana and some of the other, like Clarin and some of the other cultural heritage research infrastructures, was written completely into that. So to understand how, because the rights, access and use of those are often a big challenge, and the reuse charter helps us to help. I think the idea behind that charter is to help cultural heritage institutions to know what they can do and how they can provide access to licensing of their collections. Great, I think that's all the questions in the chat. Oh, another one come just now from Catherine. Thanks, Catherine. Have you seen any big changes in your work during the pandemic and increased need for remote access to resources? For example, i.e. more interest in projects like this one, either from within libraries, funding bodies, or the general public? Yeah, interesting. I know, so I work officially at the KBR within the within the digitization department. And I think one of the things that, and I don't know because I'd only just joined the library in October last year, digitization on demand became one of the key services. So that project was opened up, that service was opened up, and I think it's been extremely popular. So people couldn't come into the reading rooms. So it was possible to order the digitization of articles and this sort of thing from the collections during the pandemic, so they could be sent by email or other file transfer methods. And I think that is one of the big things. And the digitization department has been working extremely hard during the pandemic on this. So I think that opened up a lot. And I think that's very important for the visibility of cultural heritage institutions. People need access to these resources, and even if they can't go physically, how could they do that? And if through things like data.kbr, we could make this kind of access standard as far as possible, that would be great. Thanks for those questions.